We've had some more questions come in prior to tonight about how can coaches take this and practically apply it with youth coaching, and how can I implement the skills with all my players. So I think it's important we look at a practice or practices that we could use if this is what we're asking our players to do. How are we going to help them do this? So David, if I can invite you to talk through a couple of practices you've used linked to this topic.
Yeah, absolutely. So, with this one, this is really looking at that relationship between the winger and the pivot. So not just looking at that 1v1 ability, but also realizing the position of the pivot will influence where the space is for the 1v1 and the options that player in the 1v1 then has. So we've spoken before about it being 1v1, but can it ever really be a 1v1 when you've got players around you influencing that? So with this practice, the pass will come across from one side into the pink player, so where the arrow is, and that player is then going to have a 1v1 against the blue defender. Now here I've put an example with just one pivot who can move side to side, and there's some target areas there marked out. And we put a defender there as well up against the pivot, but if your players are really at the youth level or new to this concept, you could even have two pivots and completely unopposed. And then that would give the 1v1 player originally either a diagonal pass or a parallel pass down the line, which are quite common for the winger to link with the pivot. So you can really play around with this one a lot. But as the graphic shows, that would be sort of a perfect example to reach as a final product would be, can I go 1v1 down the line? And if my pivot shifts over to that diagonal side, well, then I've got a diagonal option. And then I could look for a set and maybe a one-touch finish, which is the growing trend. Or if we look at the amount of space that has now created, that winger can see where the pivot has gone. So now the defender is relying on communication from behind him. And within that space, can we then take advantage to go down the line and finish from wide areas, which is also an increasing trend. With that one as well, so that's a very relative practice to what the game looks like. So 1v1s in wide areas, really a cleared position 1v1. So that would be sort of the perfect example that we see at any level, really.
Thanks, David. John, you got any thoughts on that? Is that something you've used?
Yeah, of course. It's really good even for, as I say, the more experienced players to get these techniques in, as I say, and really front them up. I think there's another one that, or how you progress this on as well, is that you can have that player passing the ball in, and then the player can find the pivot. And what you can work on then is indirect entries. So we talk about the players, not necessarily the player that's passed the ball to the pivot. It's then the opposite winger that then follows that pass in and how they can attack. And I know in trends you can talk about a third man run, and that's usually the hardest thing to defend. Is always the defender will be looking at the player that's passing the ball, the player that's receiving the ball, and the ball itself. And to have that extra player on the other side make that run, all of a sudden you're now working on what Dell was alluding to before about getting those tendencies at players to attack the space off the ball. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you have the ball to be able to then pass it and then attack the space. It's those other players and what are their jobs and roles as the pass into the pivot is going on.
I think there as well, it's important. The technique as you reach sort of the higher levels, when you start reaching sort of age 14, 15, it's the importance of how that pass is played to the pivot. If it is diagonal, can you really open your hips whilst facing down the line still without having to cut inside first? Because as you cut inside, it becomes very, very obvious where your pass is going. So can we face 1v1? And then the defender then has to make a decision. Well, he could still be about to pass diagonally with the inside of his foot by opening his hip. But if I try to cheat that, then he's going to do the typical Iniesta croqueta, which is flicking it one side to the next and going down the line and beating him. So this one's really good to get that technique across and really try and teach a player that he needs to be able to go either way. One move to go left, one move to go right. Because if the pivot even comes as a parallel option, does that create space for our 1v1 to cut inside and shoot? So either way, they need to be able to go inside or outside.
Yeah, again, we're coming back to that point, aren't we? We've got to build that toolbox with that player. Delhi, any thoughts on this one?
Yeah, look, I mean, everyone has their own way of doing things, and there's no one size fits all. And I think the important thing is that there's lots of options, and sessions like this are one of those. For me, I'd look to try and see how you could do it within a game, and without critiquing the lads' sessions, because the first time I've seen it. But the difference is what we can do on a whiteboard and what we can practically do on the pitch. There can be two different things, and sessions which may well look perfect on the pitch and on the board and not necessarily perfect on the pitch, and vice versa as well. I think we need to be mindful here that how realistic is that ball that comes in, that goes into the pivot in that position, because I think you've got a slight numerical overload, but not a realistic overload, because you've got a fourth defender is going to be in there somewhere, and realistic with the setup, even if it's coming from a high pressure, you can have a player somewhere around the centre circle. That may well be the build that you've got as that session moves on. But yeah, look, it's a session, and I think that we need to think about the young players, because that's where the focus has to be. Does it work for young players? I think the key point I would say here is about pitch sizing. This is set out for 9s and 10s. You're not going to do this on a full 40 by 20 pitch. You're going to do it on an age-related, size-specific pitch for those players, to make sure that they get the confidence in being able to pass the ball, the weight of the pass, the direction of the pass, and also that it's relative to the size of pitch on a regular basis that they would play upon. But yeah, look, there's some good points. I think the key points here are the fact we've got scanning, it's body position, it's opening the body to offer the pass. Are we fronting up? Are we going to create the space to perhaps go beyond the defender and come back again? You can expand this in lots of different ways.
Yeah, and that's the thing for me. This practice allows players to practice the before, the during, and the after. It allows them to practice those things, which is why I think it's really good. Here's another one, David, similar, but just working with different players within a system. So Delhi referred to that player there that's not there. You've now put him in.
I've defined it here as fix and wing, but realistically, they could be either in terms of the position, their starting position in this one. Now, this is to really, really encourage that engaging the defender to create space behind. So here, you can start wherever you want. I mean, works a lot better deeper in the court. And that central player is going to have a choice. They're going to play at either side. And just as an initial point, straight away, I'd really, really emphasize how to disguise that pass. Which way are they going to pass the ball? And that could be by using the sole of the foot to do a heel backwards and then run, which is really common. Or they could be using the outside of the foot to disguise, or using their eyes. Once they've passed to that winger, they're going to try and attack that defender's back. And then that winger that receives the ball originally, he could try and play it over the top with one touch to teach them sort of the direct techniques that are happening. Or if there's no pass available, then he can equally square him up 1v1. And then we've created a 2v2 scenario. But as Graeme alluded to earlier, it's all about getting the size of the court right. With youth players as well, are they playing a long ball over the top? It depends on your players, I suppose. But same again, it's getting them used to the techniques that are going to help them get out of pressure. So with that one, if he has to play one touch on the wing, can it be a relevant pass? Can it be chipped over the top with a nice weight? Could it be just slightly lifted off the ground to take a bit of the weight off it? But as I've mentioned, it's really, really about engaging those defenders to create more space in behind. At the same time, that central player, as we've seen with Robinho, you could encourage players to start going 1v1 centrally. I think that would be sort of the dream. I know it's very, very difficult. It's very, very high risk. But with Robinho retiring, I know there's been a lot of talk about why aren't people being encouraged to embrace that scenario a lot more.
Yeah, okay. And I'm just trying to think the pictures that this fits from the video we saw. So you're trying to create pictures, aren't we? That first one where the furthest player forward might come out wide and leave that space that the arrows are showing. So you can't see my cursor, but if the fourth player was in, it would probably be down towards the bottom end of the court to leave space the other side. So when you bring in the next player, which I think you've suggested you might do here,
yeah,
it builds in that player. And then, as Delhi said, you've got all four players in.
Yeah, so as you move on to here, this becomes more of a game scenario. You can do it in waves of 3. So there I've got 3 yellow players waiting to come on against the players that attack will then defend the next one. You could have the same pivot for a few reps. But here I've put some markers down as well to keep the width of the court, to really encourage that space. With this one, you can change the rules as much as you'd like to. You know, when I've played this before, it's had to be either a one touch over the top from a wide position, or you could say it could be a two touch if that involves them playing into a pivot. So maybe a cut inside and a pass to the pivot. You know, it's really change it as much as you like, but try and keep the principles of play there. So really try and pull out the defenders as much as you can. You could allow the defenders to go into those channels to defend. If your players aren't that comfortable yet, could you have them not allowed to enter that space until the second touch? You know, it's really changing the rules as much as you can based on your ability, but still keeping it relevant to the game and how it's played in a usual 3-1 system.
John, anything from you on this one? And how it fits with the game?
Yeah, no, I think the pivot positioning is crucial to everything, and I think that the more that you can work on the pivot being closer towards the wing, which is more the trend as we alluded to from the start as well, and that way you can start to work on different techniques in terms of finding the pivot as well. I think usually we look for the pivot down the line, but you're starting to see players step off the line and then use the disguise pass into the pivot behind the door. You can work on those indirect movements of players coming in and then firing the pass into the pivot as well. But at the same time, you can also work on that 1v1 and how the player can really face forward first and engage and see if the pivot has created space for that 1v1 as well. So there's all different types of 1v1 scenarios that you can create in here.